Hey Hunters, HaloZoo here in a sort of special video where I'm going to talk about Magic the Gathering Planes as Dungeons and Dragons settings. So I have a list of 17 planes. These are all going to be after Time Spiral. So any plane we visited since Time Spiral in a standard set that isn't a core set. So that means no Chandelar, Vryn, Regatha as well. Also no Fiora, Kylum, and other worlds we visited in supplemental products. And also no worlds such as Olgratha, which is very old, ancient, and stupid. But oh well. That's a whole other thing. But anyway, as for how I ranked this list, I mostly went with how a world ranks mechanically, how it would fit mechanically into D&D, how it would work thematically with D&D. So as a result, you will see that worlds that either have some mechanical issue that I'm like, I just don't see this working out as well mechanically, or worlds that I don't think thematically work as well with D&D are going to be ranked lower, even if some of them are actually quite popular and people would enjoy seeing as D&D worlds. But I should also specify this is more of me ranking worlds to go to D&D as D&D settings, meaning that this is more about how does this world work in D&D, and it's just that they're all from Magic the Gathering, so it's more about D&D than Magic the Gathering, but it does use its worlds. So let's begin with number 17, and of course this is going from worst to best. The best you might be able to predict, but we'll see. Number 17, at the bottom of the list, is Ixalan, the world of giant monsters. First and foremost, there is only one player-appropriate race in humans. And I have to say, like, this is a world I would, like, purely from worlds I like, I would rank this very highly, but yeah, Worlds of Giant Monsters, just not a good campaign setting, and that's why I put it lower, is because I just don't see it working mechanically. It's up there in worlds I would love to see, and I'd say it's even in my top 5 of worlds I would really enjoy getting a book from, just because I like this setting so much, but I just don't see it working mechanically to the point I'm like, yeah, no. You got the human problem. Also, it's about giant monsters, which usually comes with higher CR, so low CR would be harder to do. And it's just one of those that's like, yeah, it's a lot of effort for a D&D book. So let's just move on. Number 16 is Kaladesh, World of Inventions. Sort of a more steampunk setting. The reason I put this so low is because it just doesn't really... It doesn't have the same issues that Echoria does, where it's very much not meant to be a D&D world. This one, I could see it potentially working. It's just it would take a lot of work to get the invention aspect to work as it should. And thus, I think thematically this world also just doesn't quite fit with what D&D has. And it's sort of like, something I'll mention now is that something I looked at was, is there a world that's similar to this one? And if so, is this that D&D already has that's kind of similar? And if so, does the magic world do well enough to sort of get away from it, or is it not quite able to? And Kaladesh is somewhat similar to Eberron, but Eberron isn't a highly industrialized world. And also, it's not as crazy with the invention. It's still a bit more of a high fantasy world with a bit of Magitech thrown in. Kaladesh is straight up Magitech everywhere. But ultimately, I think Kaladesh, not a world I would rank highly. It's also not one I personally like that much, so that doesn't help it either. Though I did try and keep my opinions out of this, as the previous answer has shown I was able to succeed. And that is number 16. Number 15 is a world I think most of you would think would be higher, but it's not. It's Innistrad, the world of gothic horror. However, the first thing I'm going to point out that hurts Innistrad is Ravenloft. D&D's done gothic horror in the past. They already have a world that's done gothic horror, so that already hurts Innistrad. And Innistrad also has the problem of being, like Echoria, a humans-only world. But there is more variation possible with vampires, werewolves, and maybe even spirits added in as player options. But Innistrad is one that I think for D&D players wouldn't be particularly incredible. So it's more like Innistrad's kind of held back by the fact that there's only humans, and it would basically be, in D&D, a worse Ravenloft. Or basically a Ravenloft where you can't play whatever you want and have to be a human. So that's what mostly hurts Innistrad, and as a result, we'll just move on to number 14, which is Strixhaven, a world we know nothing about currently, other than there's a big mage school with 5 houses, but we suspect it's going to be like Harry Potter, and I also suspect there's going to be humans at least, plus maybe 5 other races. We have to wait and see. We don't know what's on offer here, but it would also be a heavily spellcaster-focused world, though unlike some people, I don't think it's all wizards. And I might do another video talking about my predictions for Strixhaven, which is actually a set I have a lot of predictions for, more than I had for Kaldheim, actually, because Strixhaven is a bit easier to predict with the way it seems to be. What the name suggests means it's a lot easier to predict stuff for. But anyway, this is at number 14. I am pretty confident in it because it doesn't have the same issues as the previous 3, where it's like we don't really have a world that is very high magic in D&D, and we also, so the heavy mage focus could definitely be an interest, and it's not like you can't play whatever class you want. And it is worth mentioning that pretty much every class has options that could work. I mean, Barbarian is probably the worst fit, but everyone else actually has some options that make them at least somewhat magical, so you could play just about anything you wanted in Strixhaven. And it's probably not just the mage school, but Strixhaven's going to be the main focus of where we are, so that's the main thing, is it's going to be about the School of Mages, but there's other stuff as well. But we don't know yet, so anyway, moving on to 13, which is Ldrain. Ldrain is a world that it's basically a world of knights and fairy tales, mix of Arthurian legends and classic fairy tales. It also kind of has a similar issue with races in that it's mostly just humans, though fairies, merfolk, elves, and dwarves also show up. But I really just have to say that you're probably better off doing your own fairy tale world. And it kind of struggles with being classic fantasy stuff, which is very similar to what D&D already has. So once again, it kind of hurts Ldrain, where it's like, yeah, you could just play another world, another setting that actually has better race varieties, to the point that it's like, well, Ldrain would be more of a, hey, if you enjoyed Throne of Eldraine, here's a set for you. Up next at number 12 is Kamikawa, one of the least liked planes out there. And it's a world of Japanese folklore, so it does have a decent variety of races on offer, from moonfolk, kitsune, ratfolk, goblins, and snakefolk, or orochi as they're called, but I just call them snakefolk for the sake of this. But anyway, Kamikawa, once again, you're probably better off going with a basic D&D Oriental setting. Kamikawa kind of suffers from the, well, we've already done a highly Oriental setting. You're probably better off just going there. But, I mean, it's Kamikawa. There's not much to say. It's not even a well-liked plane, because the set was terrible. And it's like, yeah, it's an Oriental setting. You're probably better off making your own in terms of campaigns. Number 11, Lorwyn Shadowmoor. So this world is kind of odd because it's really two worlds mixed together. There's Lorwyn, which is kind of the bright day sort of world, and every 300 years it changes to Shadowmoor, and vice versa in Shadowmoor. And Shadowmoor is basically the night/dark world. And also, Lorwyn, pretty much everything is pretty good natured, except for elves, who are xenophobic murderers. Yeah, they're pretty bad. Meanwhile, with Shadowmoor, everything but the elves are twisted into dark reflections of who they were and are all pretty evil now. Except elves, who become good protectors of the land. The fairies aren't changed by the Aurora because of lore reasons, but interestingly, this world does not have humans. There's elves, Kithkin, which I've referred to as halflings here, merfolk, elementals, which I'm referring to as genasi here, goblins, fairies, and changelings. And this is actually the set Changeling came from, mechanically, in Magic. So it's not a bad world, but I just think, once again, it's just not particularly interesting as a D&D setting. I would rather go with most other worlds. Thus, it kind of exists at the lower end of the list. I'm not really sure where to put this even, so that's why it's here. Number 10, Pharaohs, which we recently got a book for. However, it is worth saying that book I'm not a fan of. They really screwed up the races, and it's worth saying Pharaohs is just, it's based on Greek mythology, and once again, you're probably better off just using actual Greek mythology to build a world and then add all the different player races, the normal player races too, rather than just go with Pharaohs, which is sort of a worse choice because, your race options are kind of bad. You got humans and 5 races which almost all buff strength and or con. They could have done a much better job with the race choices, but Pharaohs does have the idea of Nyx, which once again doesn't really work as well in D&D as it does in Magic, where it's like, oh, all this stuff is enchantment stuff, but you can't really do that in Pharaohs, so it sort of loses its edge, and it kind of feels like a world that's inspired by Greek myth that's for Magic the Gathering. It's like, it's cool, but I wouldn't suggest it to someone who's just into D&D, unless they want to play the Leonin Satyr, or Leonin or Satyr, which are in this book. And it is important to note that this is the book that eroded Tritons into having dark vision, which came up in Subda, which I didn't know it had been changed. I'm like, wait, do they have dark vision? Checked Bolus. Wait, they don't have dark vision. Then I looked it up. I'm like, oh, they eroded it in Theros. So that's the one good thing Theros did. However, Theros isn't that great of a world. I would have rather any of the other worlds ahead of it, and even some of the ones below it, to be honest. But to be fair, it was between ldrain and Echoria when they printed it, so yeah, Theros of the 3 was the best choice, but not one on its own. And that's something else I'll mention, is that this list is about D&D deciding, okay, we're going to make a Magic the Gathering plane into a campaign setting and ignoring anything Magic the Gathering is doing. This is just about D&D making a Magic the Gathering plane into a campaign setting. I should have specified that earlier, but that's what this is about. Number 9, Amonkhet. So this is a unique world because it's mostly based off of Egyptian mythology at its core, and then Bolus has basically put his mark on everything. It's like, it's a whole thing. However, this is much better than Theros because I think while it might seem similar to Dark Sun and Athos, this world has plenty on offer that pushes it a bit further away, as it's like, okay, well, first off, there's only one city standing. Everything else in the desert is ruins. Also, there's undead everywhere, as essentially the world is cursed to where if you die, you're cursed to come back as a zombie. And out in the desert, there's the accursed, but the anointed are zombies who were embalmed in Noctimun, the single city of the plane. and they act as servants for people who go through the trials of the 5 gods, which is the main reason I rank it far above Pharaohs. Also, the race offerings are a bit better here between Aven, Kenra, Minotaurs, and Naga. There's a lot more opportunity for variety with the races, which you don't get with Pharaohs. And I think the Trials of the 5 Gods kind of puts a unique setting if you want to use it, or it could be about surviving out in the desert after Hour of Devastation. So there's definitely a lot of room. There's also the Bolus stuff, which it's definitely a world where it's able to sort of live beyond just being a world based on Egyptian mythology and turning into a world where, yeah, there's all this mythological basis, but there's more to it than that. It's more than just an Egyptian world. It's a world of trials, a world of survival, and a world of deception and lies. And a big evil elder dragon. But that's a whole other thing. Anyway, moving on to number 8 is Kaldheim, the upcoming world for Magic the Gathering. World of Norse mythology. I misspelled changelings. Ignore the misspelling of changelings, but there's also humans, dwarves, and elves. Very limited choice of races, but this is a very interesting world, and I put it as the highest of the mythological-based settings because it's able to do a bit more because it's based on Norse mythology, but there's 10 realms linked by this thing called the Cosmos Tree. It's traveled by gods. There's a few of them. I don't remember how many off the top of my head, but there's quite a few. There's 10 realms, including Istfell, which is ruled by spirits, Karfell, overrun by zombies, Immersturm, the prison of the demons, Notwald, where the trolls rest, quite literally in some cases, Bredegard, where humans live, Axgard, which is the realm of the dwarves, Surtland, where the giants stomp around, Litjara, where the mysterious changelings hail from, Skemfar, the realm of the elves, and Starnheim, the realm of angels. But anyway, it's definitely a cool world. If you haven't seen Kaldheim's cards yet, you should check it out. It's definitely an epic world with a lot of opportunities for stories and such. And that's what gets it so high above pretty much the rest of the top-down folklore / mythology worlds. And it's sort of able to stand as its own and even manages to kind of stand up to the top 7, which is saying something for a world based heavily off of mythology. But anyway, let's move on to number 7, Mirrodin / New Phyrexia. And the theme is a world made of metal. Literally, a metal world. But anyway, there's humans, Leonin, elves, Vidalkin, goblins, and Loxodon here, as well as quite a few Phyrexians. The only issue I see with this world is that the artifact theme is a bit harder to translate into D&D, especially when it's not like, oh, it's like Kaladesh and there's inventions and stuff everywhere. So there is a bit of an issue there, but at the same time, I think it's worth doing because there's just not a world like Mirrodin in D&D. But ultimately, it doesn't really have enough to set it apart in terms of D&D. There is the metal theme, but it's ultimately like just coat of paint, really. But there is the Phyrexian stuff, which could also open a lot of opportunities for gameplay and campaigns to go. So it's definitely cool. It's just I'm not sure if it deserves to be higher. It also ranks closely with number 6, which is Dominaria, the OG Magic the Gathering world. Essentially, before we started going to different planes all the time, we just stuck with Dominaria. It was like every set was on Dominaria, except for a few, which tended to be bad. But anyway, there's, as a result, a large variety of player races on offer, such as humans, elves, aven, goblins, centaurs, dwarves, cephalids, which are squid people, Viashino, which are lizard folk, orcs, merfolk, and minotaurs. There's a lot of worlds with minotaurs right now. Phyrexians were here long ago, but they've since been wiped out. And there's a lot of stories on Dominaria. Just look up the sagas from Dominaria, and you'll see there's a lot of history on this world. And it's definitely interesting as a result, but it is kind of a high fantasy setting, which is why it's ranked lower than the next few, and there is a gap, I'll be honest, but this is able to sort of hold its own as it's like, this is a world with a lot of history. It's basically the Forgotten Realms of Magic, is how I would describe it. It's to Magic the Gathering as Forgotten Realms is to D&D. But anyway, it is another high fantasy world, which holds it back. And once again, this isn't really about its popularity in Magic, but here it actually helps the world. And yeah, I think that's enough said about Dominaria. Number 5 is Alara. So we have the World of Shards. So originally this was 5. I say originally, but it was originally one world. Then it was split into 5 shards, where basically 3 colors of magic were present, but 2 weren't. And humans lived in all of these, but the other races, including the Aven, Elves, Rocks, Leonin, Vidalkin, Viashino, Goblins, and Minotaurs, each were pretty much limited to one world, though one of them would have undead versions of some of them. And I'll mention that in a bit. But the shards were... Then when we visited in Magic the Gathering, we actually saw them collide back together into New Alara. But anyway, the shards are Esper, which is a world where pretty much everyone's turning themselves into artifacts, and control over everything is a big part of it. Grixis, a world ruled by death in shadow. There are races that don't appear in most other shards here. For example, Viashino and Aven are technically on Grixis, but they're all undead. Bant, which is the world we have the art for here, which is world of knights in order, as well as single combat. Jund, the savage world of dragons. It's basically a primal world where hunting is everything. Naya, however, is the world of giant creatures. Yeah, it cares about big creatures. Let's say that. So anyway, those are the 5 shards, and Alara is definitely a cool world, and I would love to see it done. However, I just don't think it's quite able to stand up to the merits of the next 4, which, as good of a world this is, and as good of a variety of races it has on offer, I think the next 4 just edge it out. And number 4 is Ixalan. World of exploration, pirates, and dinosaurs. Races on offer here are humans, orcs, sirens, goblins, vampires, and merfolk. So, yeah. Pretty much this is a world where I think this mechanically slots right into D&D with the exploration stuff. There is technically 2 continents we know of. There's Ixalan, which is the main continent we've seen. There's also Torazon, which is where the pirates originally came from, and the vampires rule there currently. Meanwhile, but we haven't seen it in full, as the 2 sets on this world were both set pretty much exclusively on Ixalan. But anyway, there are 4 factions here. The pirates, which I mentioned, the vampires, and also the merfolk, who are basically trying to keep everyone else away from this place called Erazka, the Golden City, which is basically El Dorado, except there's this very powerful artifact. And then the 4th faction is the Sun Empire, who are just humans who ride dinosaurs. But hey, that's cool enough on its own, so let's be honest. They're pretty cool. However, there is the Binding Seal of Ixalan, which pretty much is just a powerful artifact that most people have had. Used to be under the care of the vampires. Then the Sun Empire got it. And then this big Sphinx jerk came in and said, you know what, no one can have this anymore. And hid it away for no one to find. And had the merfolk try and keep people away from it. But anyway, Ixalan's definitely a fun world and one I would love to see, but there's just 3 worlds I think are better, including number 3, Zendikar, which I will admit a part of me thinks it should be higher, and it does seem like this should be higher because it's a world that had a lot of mechanical inspirations from D&D, so it's a no-brainer that the world inspired by D&D should absolutely be a D&D setting. But to be fair, the next 2 settings, they just fit better, as this is ultimately a high fantasy world with fewer race offerings, only having humans, elves, goblins, vampires, merfolk, core, and minotaurs. But this is definitely a world of adventure, also elementals. And it's definitely a cool world. It's a world of wild magic, crazy ruins, floating islands. It's just like, this is a world I would love to see in D&D, as I've already said. And it's actually one of my favorites. So yeah, it's definitely worth a chance. And it may or may not be the campaign setting we're getting next for D&D. Because the previous Magic the Gathering set was Zendikar Rising. And this summer, in Magic the Gathering, we're going to Forgotten Realms from D&D. So my suspicion is that there's going to be a D&D book coming out this summer alongside it that is going to be D&D going to a Magic the Gathering world. And I suspect it's going to be a Zendikar book. But that's a whole other thing, but I would not be surprised if that's what we're getting this summer. Anyway, moving on to number 2 is my personal favorite plane, Tarkir. The world of clans. Or is it dragons? Depends on the timeline. So there's basically 2 timelines, which is literally just, are dragons alive or are they extinct? And in the one where they died out, the 5 clans are ruled by the Khans. But in the other timeline where the dragons live, 5 powerful dragons rule the clans in their stead. And there are differences between the two. For example, the clans were all 3-color. The dragon broods are 2-color. And in the past, the dragons and clans fought against each other, but depending on the timeline, one ultimately rules Tarkir. So the playable races include humans, Einok, aka dog people, Aven, orcs, Jinn, Ifrit, goblins, Naga, and Loxodons, which are actually woolly mammoths instead of normal elephants. It's pretty cool. But anyway, this is a world that I admit I would put this at number 1, but ultimately I have to kind of agree that it should be second, not first, because number 1, which is Ravnica by process of elimination, is definitely good. But this one definitely holds its own. And the reason it's above Zendikar is there just isn't a world like it in D&D already. It's heavily inspired by various Asian cultures. For example, the Abzan/Dramoka are inspired by Persia. The Jeskai and Ojutai have a Chinese influence. The Sultai/Silumgar have influence from India. The Mardu/Kolagon pull inspiration from the Mongols. And the Temur/Atarka are more Siberian. So it's definitely got a lot of variety. There's also the dragon theme of the world, which is definitely a big part of what makes it special and cool. And it's definitely one I would love to see a book for. And after Zendikar, I hope we get a Tarkir book, because that would be awesome. But anyway, number 1 is Ravnica, of course. Yeah. It's big, massive city. We have already gotten a Ravnica book. And we could definitely see another, though, because, yeah, as you might notice, the playable races includes 3 more, other than just humans, elves, goblins, Vidalcan, centaurs, Loxodon, minotaurs, and Simic hybrids, which technically aren't a race on their own, but I listed them there because they were a separate race in the book. Also, I think it would be better to give each guild a archetype rather than just give Azorius and Golgari one. However, the playable races should also have included merfolk, Viashino, and vampires, which do show up. But anyway, I mean, Ravnica is the most popular plane in Magic the Gathering. Everyone loves it, or pretty much everyone loves it. I mean, it's a massive city, which is unlike anything D&D has to offer. And the 10 guilds, which are constantly squabbling, is another aspect that's like, there just isn't that in D&D already. That's what makes it such a perfect setting for D&D to go to. And ultimately, why I put it at number 1. It has a good variety of races on offer. It has an utterly unique setting compared to what D&D has already. And it doesn't help that it's the most popular Magic world. And I'm glad that for the first official D&D campaign setting book, they made it Ravnica. Now, if only they could have done the setting right and been fair to all the guilds. But no, they had to be stingy with new spells and archetypes. But anyway, I digress. And that is my list of how I would rank the 17 major Magic planes as D&D settings. So without further ado, I will see y'all next time. HaloZoo out.